On November 11, 2004, a Nashville, Tennessee jury returned a verdict in the total amount of $105 million against the DaimlerChrysler Corporation, alleging seatbacks in Daimler minivans were unsafe, defective, and unreasonably dangerous. The case involved injuries to and the death of an 8-month-old child, Joshua Flax, in a rear-end collision which occurred in Davidson County, Tennessee, on June 30th, 2001. Joshua was injured when his grandfather's 1998 Dodge Caravan minivan was hit in the rear. The front passenger seat back collapsed backward and the passenger's head hit Joshua's forehead, fracturing his skull. Joshua died the next day. Today, the Insider Exclusive will show how George Freihofer and Lee May of the law firm of Butler, Wooten, Freihofer won this historic $105 million verdict by proving that Daimler had known for over 20 years that these seats are deadly dangerous and never warned anybody. How for over 20 years Daimler and Chrysler had been marketing minivans as safe family vehicles despite evidence to the contrary by their own safety experts. How in 1992, when Chrysler appointed a minivan safety leadership team to investigate safety problems with its minivans, that same team concluded that the seatback problem needed to be fixed immediately and criticized Chrysler for not doing so. How Chrysler also ordered Paul Sheridan, the safety team's chairman, to destroy all the safety team's records and then fired him. Chrysler sued Sheridan for $82 million in an attempt to muzzle him. Chrysler never collected a dime from Sheridan. I'm Steve Murphy, and this is the Insider Exclusive, live from Atlanta, Georgia, at the Butler, Wooten, Freihofer firm. Today we have a very interesting case. It's Flax versus DaimlerChrysler. It's a wrongful death case, and it's a product liability case also. And today I have with us the lawyers on the case who worked real diligently to get a $105 million verdict. They're joining me today, Lee May and George Freihofer. How are you? Of the law firm of Butler, Wooten, Freihofer. This was a tragic case. Real tragic case. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, the case involved the death of an 8-month-old child, and the wreck that started this case happened in June 30th, 2001 in an area outside of Nashville, Tennessee. The baby's mother, Rachel Spartman, her parents, the baby's grandparents, and 2 family friends were in their 1998 Chrysler minivan. They had just pulled out of a residential driveway, had straightened out, and were struck from behind by a pickup truck driven by a man named Louis Stockel.
And this truck wasn't driving particularly fast, was it?
It was not. In fact, the experts in the case calculated the change in velocity involved in the wreck to be anywhere from 17 to 19 miles an hour.
Okay.
But despite this low speed, when the vehicle was hit from behind, the 2 front seats collapsed rearward. And when the front passenger seat collapsed, the head of the person in that collapsed seat struck the head of the 8-month-old child, Joshua. And even though Joshua was properly restrained in his child's seat, with that head moving rearward like it was, it caused a skull fracture and a brain injury, and Joshua died the next day at the hospital.
What you found out in this case was that this particular seat on the Dodge, it was a Caravan, right?
Correct.
Was probably the most unsafe seat made in any SUV or minivan, wasn't it?
It certainly was the weakest seat of all the minivans that we were aware of, and Chrysler knew for 20 years
right.
that its seats were collapsing in all of its rear impact crash testing.
We have a chart that we're showing on right now that Daimler manufactures the Mercedes and a variety of other high-end luxury vehicles, and they had stronger seats in those particular vehicles than they did in this Caravan, didn't they?
Right. Mercedes-Benz seats don't collapse in
right.
rear impacts, and Chrysler and Daimler and Mercedes have known for many years that the seat is a very important piece of safety equipment in the vehicle. And a lot of people might not really understand this, but if your seat collapses in a rear crash, all kinds of terrible things can happen to you. First, if you're the driver, when your seat collapses, when you're hit from behind, you go sliding out from under your seat belt backwards and into the back seat, or you could hit the headliner above the rear window in the back of the vehicle. And there have been a lot of people that have gotten catastrophic neck and head injuries and been killed when their own seats have collapsed and they've flown into the back seat. In addition, if you have a child behind you, as happened in this case, when that seat collapses, the occupant in the front, their head smashes into the child's head and can either kill or catastrophically brain damage the child in the case.
And I understand that the child's mother, Joshua's mother, was in that same seat next to him when this event happened, and she saw it happen right in front of her.
Right, she observed it. She was sitting right next to him and saw it happen.
Yeah.
And basically, after the seat collapsed and the occupant in the front seat smashed into Joshua's head, and the occupant in the front seat was belted. Everybody in this vehicle was belted, doing what they were supposed to be doing, where they were supposed to be doing it. And when that seat collapsed and his head hit Joshua's head, it left Joshua with a hole in the front of his head the size of a golf ball, and his mother was sitting there to witness that.
One of the amazing things that I found in this case was I understand that Chrysler, in their own test, discovered that this seat, this front passenger seat, was very weak, and they had their test equipment in the back, correct? In the back seat, and they had to reinforce the seat so that seat wouldn't damage their test equipment right behind it.
Exactly. For 20 years, for 20 years,
they were worried about their machine.
they cared more about their testing equipment than they did the children that they were encouraging parents to put directly behind these seats they knew would collapse. See, for 20 years, this seat collapsed in every rear impact crash that Chrysler ever ran on these minivans.
Yeah.
And what you're alluding to is a document that we got in discovery that showed that they were bracing the front seats to protect the testing equipment from being broken when the dummies in the front seats collapsed on top of the testing equipment, right where a child would be sitting.
And despite this, Chrysler never ran any rear impact tests on its minivan with a child dummy in the back seat. So the whole time they were marketing these minivans to people with children, they knew these seats would collapse rearward, were bracing them to protect their equipment, but never ran a single rear impact test with a child in the back seat, child dummy.
In the trial, you deposed, and we have some videotape, 2 experts. One of them was Dr. Ken
Sachowski.
And he was your expert, right?
Correct.
And then there was a David Blaisdell, who was a DaimlerChrysler safety expert.
Right.
And we're going to watch them right now, but they've come to the same conclusion.
Well, Blaisdell admitted under pressure and cross-examination that had a stronger seat been in front of Joshua, like Chrysler was selling in other vehicles, like it sold in the Chrysler Sebring, had that seat been there, then Joshua would not have been injured and would not have been killed. And Blaisdell also admitted that as more children move from the front seat into the back seat, where Chrysler urges parents to put them, as more children move into the back seat, more and more children will be killed from these defective, collapsing seats going forward into the future.
We're going to go to that videotape now.
Sir, you know that over time, as more children move into the back seat, the number of children injured from these yielding seats will increase. Isn't that correct, sir?
I think there may be an increase in that, probably a decrease in the side-to-side impacts that happen if they're in the front seat, and other injuries that happen in the front seat, but there would be a decrease in the, or an increase in the number of children and exposure to that, yes.
More children getting killed and injured, right, sir?
Well, there'd be more exposure, which I suppose could translate to that. We don't know.
That translates into real deaths and injuries, doesn't it, sir?
It could, sure.
Dr. Sachowski, from an engineering point of view, what has happened in the past with the failures of these minivan seats and the injuries to those in them and behind them, and deaths of those in them and behind them, tell you as an engineer is going to happen in the future unless that problem is addressed?
You're going to continue to see fatal and serious injuries to both front and rear occupants unless that problem is improved.
For 20 years, they've been marketing this minivan as family-safe vehicles, safe family vehicles.
In fact, we introduced in evidence a number of their advertisements. In some of their advertisements, they said that they designed the minivan expressly for children. They describe it as a family room on wheels. They included an advertisement that showed a little crayon drawing a child had done and said, "We designed this vehicle for children." And each and every one of these parents who'd had their child injured or killed by a collapsing seat had no idea of the danger. They thought they were buying a safe family minivan to put their kids in, to strap them in car seats, right where they're supposed to be. And this can happen. It's frankly appalling.
You know, as a result of these kinds of lawsuits, this was a big verdict, $105 million, and we're going to get into later the route that it took up the legal ladder up to the U.S. Supreme Court. But when these kind of verdicts come down, does it cause the automobile manufacturers to say, we got to make some changes?
Well, you know, it should, but I'm not sure it really does.
Yeah.
Because for them, so much of this is a cost of doing business.
Sure.
It's actually cheaper for them, and they make this calculation, cheaper for them not to fix the problem and pay the claims than it is to fix the problem and warn people about what's out there and what to do to avoid these kind of injuries to their children. So it should make a difference, but oftentimes it doesn't.
Do you have any idea what it would have cost to make this change?
Basically, Chrysler's own internal document showed that they could double the strength of the seat, which would have made a difference in this crash, for about $7 per seat. Mm-hmm. That is to include a double recliner instead of a single-sided recliner. So $7 per seat, 2 front seats, 7 million minivans on the road. That was approximately $98 million, which coincidentally happens to be the number that the jury chose, $98 million for the punitive damages part of the verdict.
Coincidentally, or did you point that out to the jury?
Well, the jury heard the evidence.
Yeah. I mean, were they aware of the fact that had they invested this additional $7, it would have made $98 million?
The document that showed Chrysler had not put the double-sided recliner in as a result of the cost of that, and the cost was only $7 per seat, was in evidence in the case, and the jury had that in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the jury was also aware that there were 7 million minivans on the road that had this particular problem. So there were 7 million families out there with minivans who potentially could have their children injured in a case just like Joshua, who had no idea about this problem.
So my question is, here we are in 2009, some of those minivans are still rolling around on the roads. Have they all been recalled to strengthen the seat?
No, none of them have been recalled, and that is the greatest tragedy of all of this.
So theoretically, if someone was injured right now, they could use this case to get a great verdict, couldn't they?
Well, they could certainly use the evidence that we developed in this case, but that's a terrible tragedy, almost a ticking time bomb waiting to happen. There are 7 million of these vehicles still on the road, and parents don't know about this danger. Chrysler hasn't warned anybody. They haven't fixed the seats. And just as their expert admitted, children are going to continue to be brain damaged and killed when these seats collapse in the wrecks that we know are going to happen.
And even if Chrysler didn't want to fix the problem by warning parents and saying, if you want to put a child in one of our minivans, put them behind a seat that is unoccupied, because an unoccupied seat won't collapse. That could help parents make decisions about their children's safety. Or put the children in the third row in the middle where they would not be in the way of a collapsing front seat. But they even refuse to give that kind of information to parents so they can decide what kind of risk they want to expose their children to.
I'm amazed that the government didn't make them strengthen or recall every Dodge Caravan or similar vehicle made under a different name and had that seat strengthened. I'm amazed.
There's a lot of misconceptions out there. The public thinks that NHTSA, the government, actually will prevent these kind of product design defect issues, and they don't. NHTSA has never recalled a product. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has never recalled a product for a design defect. All the recalls have been voluntary recalls with the manufacturers. The truth is, the automakers own NHTSA. there's a revolving door between the automakers and the leadership at NHTSA, and the automakers have resisted increasing seat back strength for almost 50 years. The minimum level of seat back strength that's required by the federal government motor vehicle safety standards is the same as it was in the 1960s. Now, during that time, we've gone to the moon and back. We've had the computer revolution, and the seat back strength the minimum seat back strength is the same as it was set in the mid-60s. It's frankly absurd, and this continues to happen because the automakers continue to get away with it, and NHTSA lets them get away with it.
Let me ask you, when we're talking about strengthening the seat back, what actually happens to strengthen the seat back? What would they put in there extra to strengthen it?
Well, it's
what's in there now, and what would they add?
Well, in the seat that was in the minivan in this wreck had what's called a single recliner. So basically it was one hinge on one side of the seat.
On only one side? On
one side. So a very easy, safer fix to that is to do what they call a dual recliner design, which is to put
down the bottom.
Right. Yeah. Now, another thing that you can do is you can do what's called a belt integrated seat, and those are much stronger. They're the seats.
The one over the chest?
Exactly. It's the seats where the seat belt is actually mounted in the seat.
Yeah.
And that design by its very nature is very strong because it has to provide the anchor for the seat belt. There are a lot of easy fixes. In fact, one of our experts has done some testing where he's just mounted a seat belt behind the seat just kind of as a brace, and that doesn't collapse rearward in the way that these weak seats do.
In today's world, with Chrysler going bankrupt, out of business, if a person has a problem now with a Dodge Caravan, do they have a claim?
Well, under pressure from the government, Chrysler has agreed to defend and pay product liability claims that happened after Chrysler emerged from bankruptcy, which I believe was sometime in June.
Yeah.
June of 2009. So basically, if this happens, as it will inevitably happen to other families, they'll get hit from behind, their seats will collapse, and either they in the seat, the adult in the seat, or a child behind it gets injured. As long as that crash happens after Chrysler emerged from bankruptcy in June of 2009, they can bring a case against Chrysler, and Chrysler will defend and pay the damages in that case.
But there are people who had filed suits against Chrysler whose suits had not finished going through the court system, and their claims were wiped out. So there are people that were injured by these seats that were affected by the bankruptcy.
So these are people that filed before the bankruptcy. Bankruptcy happens, their claim goes away. They cannot refile.
Well, their claim gets dealt with in the bankruptcy court, and there are limitations on what they can recover, and it's usually some cents on the dollar.
It seems very unfair.
It's extremely unfair.
Now, there was a leadership team, a minivan, Chrysler called this, right? Chrysler minivan safety leadership team that actually investigated in 1992 the seat, the effectiveness of the seat. And they appointed a gentleman by the name of Paul Sheridan, I think his name was, right, to chair this committee. What did they find out?
Basically, the minivan safety leadership team was charged with looking at the minivan and identifying all aspects of it that needed to be improved from a safety point of view. And they made Paul Sheridan the chairman. They picked him as their chairman. He was part of the minivan executive group. And they began to investigate the performance of the seat and discovered that the seat was collapsing in crashes, injuring and killing people in the seat and children behind it. And this committee determined that the minivan seat was not adequate to protect customers. And very telling was the fact of Chrysler's response to that. They actually put their minutes together of that committee meeting and distributed those minutes around the company to some of the high executives in the company. And the response from the company was not, oh, thank you for telling us about this safety problem. Let's fix the seats and protect our consumers who rely on us to put their kids in these seats. The response from the corporation was to order Sheridan to retrieve and destroy, that is, go around and collect all the minutes of the committee meeting that were critical of the seats. They then disbanded the minivan safety leadership team, and they fired Paul Sheridan. And the jury heard all that evidence in this case.
And we're going to go to the trial testimony, videotape trial testimony, correct?
Correct.
Of him talking about that. which I find outrageous. Let's do that right now.
By 1993, we on the safety leadership team were aware of the fact that people were being injured or killed in Chrysler vehicles, minivans in particular, where the front seat backs were collapsing as a result of a rear-end collision.
You have a copy of the meeting minutes for the March 16, 1993 meeting of the safety leadership team.
No.
Did you have a copy?
Yes.
What happened to all the copies?
Well, they were in my office. I distributed them, and after distributing them, I was asked to retrieve and destroy them. He said to me that he had received a telephone call from Mr. Francois Castang,
That's the head engineer?
the head of engineering, and that Mr. Castang, to use the exact word, was livid with the meeting minutes and the fact that we were playing the 60 minutes video. And Mr. Castang sent out a directive through Mr. Zarowitz to me that we round up the meeting minutes and destroy them.
Wow, that's amazing. They hire a guy to investigate what the problem is, they find out what the problem is, and they fire him, you know.
And I think the whole amazing thing about it is that that testimony was unrebutted at trial. Chrysler did not bring a single witness to say anything different than what Paul Sheridan did.
Yeah.
And on cross-examination, basically they had nothing to discredit what Paul Sheridan said about the merits of his testimony.
Yeah. We have with us today the mother of Joshua, Rachel. She's going to be joining with us in a minute. So let's bring her on right now. I have the great pleasure of introducing Joshua's mom, Rachel Arnold. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming here today. You flew all the way from Tennessee, right?
Yes.
Tell us, if you can go back to that day, this tragic day. Tell us what happened that day.
We were hit. We were in a car accident on that day. We were pulling out of a driveway, and once we pulled out of the driveway, there was a car that came around, or a truck rather, that came and hit us from the rear.
And it was just all so quick, wasn't it?
Yes.
You were sitting right next to your son, weren't you?
Yes.
In the second seat?
Yes, in the middle row.
What was your immediate reaction? What did you do?
Once everything was done, I immediately looked over and saw that my son's forehead was completely smashed in.
Really? And it was from the force of the head of the person sitting in the front
Yes.
passenger seat, the
Yeah.
seat that collapsed.
Yes.
Were you aware that the seats in the Dodge Caravan were so unsafe?
No, we were not.
I think in your trial testimony you were asked, had you known that, you would not even bought this car.
Correct.
You bought it not too long before then, didn't you?
Right. It was my parents' vehicle that they
parents.
had bought. Yeah, and they had owned a Caravan years ago and
Yeah.
got rid of it because of the safety issues, but then
Really?
they were told that safety was not an issue anymore, that it was a safe vehicle at that point.
Well, again, I am very sorry for your loss. And money can never compensate anybody for a tragedy like this. And I certainly appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you.
And one thing I wanted to say about Rachel and her family is that this has never been for them about money. It's
Yeah.
been to get the word out
Yeah.
that parents need to know about this problem. They need to know that this can be a danger to their children. They need to be aware of this so they can make the decisions that need to be made about a child's safety with the complete knowledge of what's going on.
Yeah.
And they've always been very much focused on letting Chrysler know about what happened
Yeah.
to their son and hoping that this would cause them to make a change.
Yeah, and that's why we're doing this show, because as of right now, Chrysler has never recalled those Dodge Caravans and other minivans that are made under different names but with the same seat, have they?
Right.
There's other tragedies out there waiting to happen, and thank you for spreading the word again. Well, you got this $105.5 million verdict, tremendous verdict, but the audience needs to know that the work didn't end just with that verdict, did it?
Right, that was 2004, and beginning in 2004, Chrysler took us on an appellate odyssey that spanned the next 5 years. They first asked the trial judge to remit the verdict, and the trial judge remitted the punitive damages, that is reduced the
Right.
punitive damages from $98 million down to $20 million. because he thought that the $20 million was a more appropriate ratio to the $7.5 million in compensatory damages that had been awarded. Then, unsatisfied with that, Chrysler appealed to the Tennessee Court of Appeals, and the Tennessee Court of Appeals accepted Chrysler's arguments that the punitive damages were excessive and shouldn't have been awarded, and vacated the punitive damages. We believe that that was manifestly incorrect because the evidence of punitive damages to support punitive damages in this case was absolutely overwhelming. And so we then petitioned to the Tennessee Supreme Court for a discretionary application for appeal to ask the Tennessee Supreme Court to state what the standard was going to be for awarding punitive damages in Tennessee.
Yes.
And the Tennessee Supreme Court looked at the overwhelming evidence that we put on of Chrysler's knowing misconduct and wanton and reckless disregard for the safety of these parents and these families and these children, and determined that this clearly stated a case for punitive damages. They reinstated the punitive damages award and ultimately affirmed a judgment with interest that came at the end of the process to about $23 million. Chrysler still wasn't satisfied. Chrysler appealed or filed a petition for certiorari to the U.S. Supreme Court, asking the U.S. Supreme Court to take the case and either reduce or eliminate the punitive damages. And we handled both the Supreme Court appellate practice and the practice through the Tennessee courts ourselves, which is kind of unusual. A lot of trial lawyers don't do their own appellate work, but we do. We're both appellate lawyers and trial lawyers, and in fact, the best appellate lawyers are those that also are familiar with the trial record. And so we defended the case through the U.S. Supreme Court, and in May of 2009, the U.S. Supreme Court denied certiorari, and the case came to a conclusion and the judgment was final.
Well, thank God for lawyers like your firm, and I'm very pleased and gratified that we were able to spend some time with us today. Thank you very much, Lee, and thank you very much, George.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. To get more information about our guest and the cases, please visit www.insiderexclusive.tv. Thank you.